Chapter 37. A low growl rumbled out of his throat as he threw his head back and squeezed his eyes shut. His mind was fighting with his body to control his shift, but it was a battle he was quickly losing. Sweat popped out across his body as his muscles strained to accommodate his new form. He fell to his knees, adrenaline coursing through him, fueling his transition into wolf. His muscles stretched and lengthened as his tendons shifted into his new body. Why the fuck couldn't he control his own goddamn body? He couldn't continue to live this way. He wouldn't. He lifted his head and opened his eyes, hoping Skylar had the sense to take off before he could hurt her. Zane. He jerked his head to the corner of the room, where she was standing like a goddess in nothing but that damn sheet wrapped around her. Her beautiful red hair hung like satin curtains to her shoulders, and her blue eyes met his. He growled, showing off his teeth and hoping she would get the hint and run like hell. She dropped to one knee and held out her hand. I know you won't hurt me. Trust you. Rage and anger pulsed through his body. The urge to taste blood swamped him. How the hell was he not going to hurt her? He had lost all his control. Why? Didn't she understand? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the shift back into human. But his body couldn't be controlled. He couldn't be controlled. Opening his eyes, he saw his target and pounced. Chapter 38. Skylar had braced herself, hoping that any minute Zane was going to snap out of it and shift back into his human form, or at best be able to control his anger in wolf form. She knew she had figured wrong the second his eyes popped open and his pupils dilated. The only thing she could do now was brace herself for the attack. He pounced and shoved her to the floor, and his massive body pinned her down. She sucked in a breath at the impact. His hot breath was inches away from her neck as he growled low and deadly. Bloodlust. He wanted blood. He wanted her blood. The realization had her frantically searching for some object on the floor with which to defend herself. A shoebox sat a foot away from her face. She never bought shoes, and she sure as hell couldn't remember what she'd put inside this particular box. Hopefully something heavy like a brick. She reached out and grabbed the box with one hand. Surprisingly, it was pretty heavy. Her fingers found the top and she tried to pry open the lid, but it wasn't budging. It was tied down with some twine. Zane lifted his head back and growled, and she knew what was coming next. He was going to rip her throat out. She'd been around alpha males enough to know the drill. Once they were set on bloodlust, nothing would satisfy them. They needed the taste, craved it. Grasping the shoebox in her hand, she brought it down hard across Zane's furry head. He fell off her and collapsed in a heap on the floor. Oh shit. I killed him. Her heart dropped to her toes. Please God, tell me I didn't kill him. A tear escaped from behind her eyes and rolled down her cheek. Forgetting her. She crawled over to his lifeless body and laid her head on his chest. He was so very still. She held her breath as she waited for his heart to beat. When she felt the strong, steady beat against her cheek, she let tears fall freely. Lying down beside him, she sobbed into his fur. Chapter 39. I like this one, Ava. Granny pointed to the painting in shades of green and yellow and gray that hung along the brick wall of Auntie Allison's art studio. It reminds me of coming home again. It reminds me of a hot summer day and lying naked in the grass. Ava nodded and turned to Damon. Damon, what does this remind you of? It reminds me that I need to be working on a mission for Barrett instead of wandering around some artsy-fartsy studio. He scowled and placed his hands on his hips. But I want to get some art for our home. Ava pouted and snuggled up to him. Damn, he was always a goner whenever she touched him. I didn't say you couldn't get any. I just don't think I need to be here with you. He traced a finger down her cheek. I want you here with me. She slid her arms around his neck and smiled up at him. He pulled her tighter into his embrace, once again struck by the reality that she was all his. I know, baby, but I have a job I need to do. What kind of work do you do, Mr. Trahan? Auntie Allison, the artist and proprietor, shot him a friendly smile. You could say I'm in the protection business. He cut his eyes at the petite blonde. Oh, like a bodyguard. How exciting. Her smile brightened. Ava snorted and shook her head before slipping out of his arms. Andy, I think I want to take those two over there. I know just the place to hang them. Perfect. I'll get them ready for you. The artist began taking down the artwork. I like this one too. Granny announced from the other side of the room. It reminds me of something familiar. Damon followed Ava over to where Granny was standing. Damon snorted as his gaze fell upon the picture that was leaning up against the wall. It's something you haven't seen in about 50 years, Damon said as he took in the painting that clearly resembled a 3-foot penis. Granny, are you sure you want that one? Ava cut her eyes at Damon. Of course, dear. Why wouldn't I? 'Cause it looks like a dick. Damon barked out a laugh. Damon. Ava jabbed him in the ribs. Oh dear. Andy hurried over to them and gave them an apologetic smile. He didn't miss how the blush stole over her cheeks. I'm afraid that's not for sale. You see, one of my students did that, and it didn't turn out quite like it was supposed to. The blush darkened. Was it supposed to be a dick? Damon asked. Ava jabbed him hard in the side. I think she was trying to paint a tree. Andy put her arm around Granny and tried to herd the old lady away. But Granny wasn't having it. She shrugged out of the woman's grip and shook her head. But I'm interested in purchasing this piece. Granny pursed her lips and continued to gaze upon the painting. I'm sorry, but I really can't sell it. Andy nibbled on her bottom lip as she looked to Ava for help. You don't want that, Granny, Damon offered. The last thing the woman needed was a picture of a giant dick hanging over her dining room table. Thanksgiving would never be the same again. Besides, it belongs to her student and she can't legally sell something that doesn't belong to her. Fine. Granny pursed her wrinkled lips and gave Andy a stern look that would make most humans back down. But to her credit, Andy didn't budge. She just stood there with a cheery smile on her face. I do have something in the back you might like. You did say you were from Louisiana. That's right. Granny cocked her head, clearly interested in what the artist had that might pique her interest. I'll be right back. A few seconds later, Andy returned with a sizable canvas and leaned it against the brick wall. Abstract bright red and fuchsia swirls and slashes of green were painted behind what appeared to be an abstract black wrought iron fence. It's beautiful, and it reminds me of one of the gardens in the Garden District of New Orleans. Granny's wide smile stretched her wrinkles to the corners. That's where I got my inspiration. Andy clasped her hands together as a look of unabashed pleasure crossed his face. I stayed at a B&B there on my last trip to New Orleans. It's perfect. I'll take this instead. Granny pulled her wallet out of her white plastic purse. I'll wrap it for you so it won't get damaged. Damon sighed and glanced at his Luminox watch again. What's with you anyway? Ava came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. Her small pert breasts pressed into his back, eliciting a reaction from his body. Nothing. Art isn't my thing. You know that, Ava. He turned, pulling her into his embrace. She looked up and narrowed her astute eyes at him. You're not just here on a visit, are you? Did Barrett send you here on a mission? He pressed his lips together in a thin line, warning her not to say anything, especially around Granny. The last thing he needed was her interference while on a recon mission for his packmaster. Ava, he warned. I know. You can't tell me. She pouted. That's right. You knew what you were getting into when you mated me. He grinned and pressed his lips to hers in a heated kiss. Her lips parted, and he didn't miss his chance to taste her sweet mouth. He groaned as he dipped his tongue between her lips while holding her snug against his body. Her hands slid up his bare arms and laced together behind his neck, pulling him further into the kiss. His body began to ache with that familiar need that always grew when she was in his arms. Nothing ever felt as good as his Ava. Nothing. Ahem. Granny cleared her throat behind him. Reluctantly, he pulled away from his mate and faced the older woman. Now, you two need to have better manners than to be making out like two rats in a wool sock. Why, Mrs. Allison is going to think I've raised a wild animal. Ava barked out a laugh at the ironic meaning while he gave Granny a smile. No. One would think that, Granny. They better not. I've got a reputation to protect, you know. She hiked her white purse up on her shoulder and nodded at him to take the canvases the artist had wrapped for them. Thank you so much. I hope you'll enjoy your new pieces. Andy handed the canvases to Damon and smiled. He breathed out a sigh of relief as they made their way out the door. One day at the gallery was enough to last him a lifetime. Chapter 40. Pain seared his head as Zane blinked his eyes open and stared up at the white, bumpy ceiling. He held up his hand. He'd shifted back to his human form while he had been unconscious. Wincing, he glanced down at the heavy weight that was pressed against his chest. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips when he saw Skylar's dark red locks spilled out across his skin. Her slender shoulders were shaking as tears slid down her face and landed on his naked chest. He cupped the back of her head. Skylar. Her head jerked up and she met his gaze. Oh my God. I thought I'd killed you. And then I saw you were breathing and I thought maybe you had brain damage because you wouldn't wake up. You've been out all day. She buried her face in the crook of his neck and clung to him like a vine. Nope. No damage. He winced as another pain shot through his skull. He rubbed the side of his head. What did you have in that box anyway? A brick. No. Rocks, she said pitifully. Of course. What else would be in a shoebox? He wanted to laugh, but it hurt. Too fucking bad. She pulled away and met his gaze. Her lip quivered as she stared at him, so very serious. Sophia gave it to me. She collects rocks and she wanted me to have a collection too. He eased up on his elbows and glanced down at his nudity. Skylar glanced at his erection, and her face turned a pretty shade of pink. She looked away as she tried to continue her conversation. Who's Sophia? A very special friend. Skylar gave him a true smile. Whoever Sophia was made Skylar happy. He was glad she had a friend she could count on. Although he did wonder about a grown-ass woman collecting rocks. Seemed kind of juvenile. To each her own. He got his feet under him while Skylar kept her arm around his waist to steady him. He didn't bother telling her that there was no way she could bear his weight if he did fall. He liked the way she felt against him too much to say anything. He ambled into the living room and eased himself onto the couch. While he didn't feel any blood coursing down the side of his head, he knew that it was probably bruised at best. He glanced out the window into the darkness. Gee, must have hit him pretty hard to make him lose consciousness for almost 12 hours. You know how to handle yourself, I'll give you that. He cracked a smile. God, Zane, I'm so sorry. It was just you had bloodlust in your eyes and it was like you couldn't even see me. He cupped a hand under her chin. His thumb grazed the bottom of her full lip as he searched her face. Don't be sorry. You did what you needed to do. I'm the one who needs to apologize. His chest ached with remorse. He could have killed her, and he wouldn't have remembered any of it. I'm so sorry, Skylar. While I'm like this and unable to control my shift or my actions, I am a danger to you. He stood and shook his head and looked around her apartment. I can't stop ruining the clothes you get me, but I can't stay here. He hated this. He hated not having any kind of damn control over anything. He lived his life by the code of the pack, and he'd strived his whole life to keep his body in control and under discipline. Hell, control and discipline were what made him a good soldier. That was what made him a hell of a guardian. You can't leave. She jumped to her feet. Where the hell are you going to go? Someone is going to see you shift, and then where will you be? Her eyes widened with each word. If there's a risk that I can lose control and hurt you, then I can't stay here. You know that. His words came out harsher than he meant them to, but his gut was still twisting with what could have happened if Skylar hadn't knocked him out. I can handle myself. You said so yourself. You don't need to worry about me. She stuck her hands in her jeans pockets and lifted her chin in that defiant way she'd had as a child. I could never live with myself if I hurt you. If something happened to you. Don't you understand? He grabbed her arms and gave her a little shake, hoping the gravity of the situation would sink into that thick skull of hers. Don't do that. You don't tell me what to do. She wrenched free of his hold and took a step back while piercing him with a glare. Stop being so unreasonable. You know as well as I do that if I lost control, I could hurt you. And you know that I can handle myself. Believe me, I've had to do that since I was a child. This is different. This is dangerous. What did you think my childhood consisted of? Puppies and cartoons. She curled her fingers into fists and leaned into his space. By the time I was old enough to walk, I knew I had to find places to hide to keep my father from hitting me when he got drunk. By the time I was in school, I knew enough to Stay out of his way and hide the food I managed to take from your house under my bed so I wouldn't go days without eating. And when I hit puberty and started looking like a young woman, I had to learn how to hit back hard enough so I wouldn't be raped by my father's friends. So don't you sit there and tell me I'm some helpless female when it comes to out-of-control werewolves who don't give a shit about anyone but themselves. Chest heaving and eyes flashing with anger, she spun on her heel and headed into the bathroom. Zane felt like he'd been hit in the chest by a 2x4. He'd known her life had not been easy, but never in a million years would he have guessed she was physically abused. Anger flooded his body like lava in a volcano, the image of her piece of shit father trying to hit her, or even worse, letting his friends try to lay their hands on her, had rage flooding through his body. He was quickly losing control and he didn't fucking care anymore. He lifted his head back and growled as the shift began to take over his body. He wanted nothing more than to seek out her offenders and rip them apart with his teeth, until they were nothing but a bloody smear on the ground. Chapter 41. The bathroom door flew open and Skylar came barreling out as a loud roar echoed through the small apartment. Zane, what the hell are you doing? Keep it down or nosy old Mrs. Nelson is going to call the cops, she hissed at him. He once again shifted into wolf form and began pacing the tiny living room floor. He would make it 2 steps before turning around. He looked more like a caged tiger than a werewolf. The last thing I need is her interference. She didn't have time to look for another apartment, and she doubted she could find one as cheap as this one. Every spare cent went into her business. She wanted to keep a low profile, get her business on solid footing, and get her project going for girls who needed a safe place to stay. That was her priority, and now Zane was going to ruin everything with his whole alpha male routine. Knock, knock, knock. She stiffened and Zane stopped his pacing. Maybe if they stayed quiet, whoever it was would go away. Knock, knock, knock. She shot him a glare when she saw that wasn't happening. Go in the bedroom and stay there, she whispered. He didn't move for a few seconds and she wondered if she was going to have to grab him by his hairy tail and drag him. He stared at her through intense, wolfy eyes, and she fought the tiny shiver of fear that zinged through her stomach at the memory of what had happened the last time he shifted. She didn't want to hurt him, nor did she want to draw attention to herself by having him here. Please, she implored. He gave a low growl and lumbered back into the bedroom. She closed the door behind him. She grabbed the remote control off the small table by the couch and turned on the stereo system. Glad she'd put her robe on, she slowly walked to the door and pressed her sweaty palms to her thighs before reaching for the doorknob. Easing open the door, she blinked in surprise. Hector, what are you doing here? He was standing there holding his daughter, Sophia, in his arms. Skylar looked over his shoulder as Mrs. Nelson popped her head out her own door, scowled and slammed it shut. Thank God the old woman didn't want to talk. What the hell is going on in there? He cocked his head and looked around. Her. Just listening to the radio, that's all, she said a little too quickly. She held her breath, hoping he wouldn't ask to come inside. She wasn't sure how Zane was going to react to another male in her apartment. Look, Maria is in labor, and I need Sophia to stay with you tonight. He gave her a wide-eyed, frantic stare as she sleepy-eyed child raised her head off his shoulder and held her arms up for Skylar to take her. Her heart tugged as she took Sophia in her arms. The little girl laid her head back on her shoulder. Where are your other kids? She looked out behind him to make sure they were not in tow, but he was alone. They are at the neighbor's house. I couldn't leave Sophia there because she's allergic to the neighbor's cat. The last time she went over there she had hives for a week. His breathing grew more rapid. What about dogs? Is she allergic to dogs? Zane had probably shed enough to make a coat. She didn't need Sophia to have a reaction to that as well. No, just cats. Hector shook his head. Look, Skylar, I understand this is really bad timing, but I don't have anyone else I can call. He pressed a small pink princess backpack in her hand and began backing away. I'll be back tomorrow to pick her up. My mother is driving in from Louisiana to stay with the kids. He jogged to his truck and called out before jumping into the driver's seat. I owe you one, boss. With a wave of his hand, he cranked up the old truck, backed out of the parking space and tore out of the parking lot. Skylar, I'm tired. Sophia wrapped her arms tighter around Skylar's neck and settled against her shoulder. She couldn't help but smile, and she patted the child's tiny back. Her fingers brushed the soft cotton pajamas that were the color of cotton candy. She stepped inside and shut the door. "Doggy," Sophia said in her sleepy voice as she raised her head and looked over Skylar's shoulder. She spun around. Zane stood in the middle of the open bedroom doorway. "How did you get out?" Her eyes widened. He cocked his head to the side and stared at Sophia in her arms. "Shit." She slammed a hand over her mouth. She never cursed, and certainly not in front of children. But Zane made her do a lot of things she didn't normally do. Skylar said a bad word. "I know, sweetie. I'm sorry." She tightened her hold on the little girl. She might care for Zane, but she sure as hell wasn't going to let him hurt Sophia. "Doggy." Apparently, Skylar's bad language was quickly forgotten as Sophia turned back to Zane. She tried to wiggle out her other arm to reach for the animal, but Skylar tightened her hold on the child. "Doggy," Sophia whimpered. Skylar met his wolf's gaze and narrowed her eyes. "Don't you dare think about touching her." Much to her surprise, he lowered his head and then curled up on the floor, all the while keeping his eyes on them both. His eyes no longer glinted yellow, promising bloodlust. Instead, they were his normal blue color. She slowly turned so Sophia could look at the doggy. He rested his long snout between his outstretched paws. His dark fur ruffled a little as the air conditioner vent overhead circulated the cool air. He held her gaze, only breaking his stare to blink. His chest rose and fell in an even rhythm, one she'd not seen when he'd shifted before. Odd. Usually he was on edge, angry and dangerous. But now he looked as if he could control his emotions a bit better. "Zane." She spoke his name quietly and stepped closer. Right now he was between her and the bedroom door. She needed to get Sophia to bed, and she didn't intend on spending the night on the couch with a 4-year-old. She had too much work she needed to get done tomorrow since she was a day behind. "I need you to move so we can get to bed." Zane lifted his head and squinted at her. Her heart stumbled to a halt in her chest, and she forced herself to suck in deep breaths. Just getting upset and showing fear was the worst possible thing she could do right now. "Move," she repeated and hugged Sophia close to her chest. A low rumble came from behind his closed lips, yet he didn't show his teeth. He looked like he was pissed at having to move his large body out of the way. Slowly he got to his feet and let out a sigh like she was inconveniencing him. He padded over to a corner, walked out a circle and lay down. She arched an eyebrow and waited a few seconds before heading into the bedroom and shutting the door behind her. She reached out to turn the lock on the doorknob. Her fingers brushed across something wet. So that's how he opened the door. With his mouth. She wiped her hand on her robe as she walked over to the bed, pulling down the comforter she placed Sophia in the soft bed and tucked her in. "I'll be right back." She brushed the hair out of the child's face as her eyelids fluttered closed. She turned on the faucet and made quick work of brushing her teeth. She peeked her head around the corner to make sure Sophia hadn't gotten up. A smile lit her face as she watched the little girl sleep deeply. Her arms were stretched over her head and her pouty lips were slightly parted. Her pink pajamas were hiked up, showing off her chubby stomach. She tiptoed in the room and carefully opened a drawer and pulled out an old t-shirt and some shorts. She didn't usually sleep in anything, but with Sophia here and Zane in the next room, tonight called for clothing. After donning the t-shirt and shorts, Skylar slipped between the covers, careful not to wake her little bed partner. Out in the distance, the first peals of thunder echoed and a brief flash of lightning slashed across the sky. Skylar settled into the bed and smiled with the promise of rain. At least it was going to be a good night to sleep. After today's events, she needed it. Chapter 42. Zane woke to booming thunder that rattled the tiny windows of the apartment. He sat up and frowned at his nakedness. Easing up off the floor, he looked around. His gaze landed on a greenback sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter. He remembered Skylar bitching about having to buy him clothes. Another round of thunder echoed outside. Despite her own hectic schedule, she always seemed to be anticipating what he would need next. She was fluidity to his discipline. He opened the bag and pulled out a white t-shirt with an 80s band scrawled across the front, then a pair of jeans. They were just his size. At least he didn't have to replace the boots she bought him earlier. That was the one thing he never ruined when he shifted. He pulled on the jeans, smirking as he realized she didn't buy him any underwear. Maybe it was a subconscious thought on her part. Lightning stretched across the sky like claws. He ambled over to the window and pulled back the flimsy white curtain, resting his hand on the top of the windowsill. He gazed out at the summer storm rolling in. The parking lot was half full and all the other tenants' windows were dark. The only light was the lightning in the bleak sky. He glanced over at the clock on the microwave and noted the time. 2 a.m. It would be light in a few hours. And once that sun came up he was going to have to leave. He needed to find the cure to whatever was preventing him from controlling his shift. Pushing away from the window, he sunk onto the couch. It was too short for him to be able to stretch out, but if he bent his knees he should be able to sleep in that position. He'd slept in worse conditions than this. Hell, at least he was inside and out of the weather. Chapter 43. Skylar yawned and stretched out in the bed as the light of dawn sparkled through her window. She glanced over and noted the sky was bright and clear, with no evidence of last night's rain. She turned over to check on Sophia. Her heart stuttered to a standstill when she saw the bed was empty. She jumped out of bed and threw open the bedroom door. She made it only a few steps before she froze at what she saw on the couch. Zane had shifted back into his human form and was lying on his back on the couch. Little Sophia was lying sprawled on his bare chest, and he had his arm draped over her back, making sure she wouldn't fall. Her heart and her womb lurched at the tender sight. She let a sigh slip past her lips as she brushed her hand over her heart. Zane stirred and blinked awake. He glanced down at the child in his arms and then up at her. Morning. His hoarse voice had her stomach turning warm with desire. She cleared her throat and nodded toward the precious package he was holding. How did she end up here? Her gaze flitted back to his sleepy eyes. Not sure. She came out during the night when the thunder got bad. She must have thought I was her dad, 'cause the next thing I knew she'd crawled up on me like a ladder and laid down. He tried to shrug from his reclining position. I didn't want to disturb her, so I let her sleep. Oh. She swallowed. Her throat was like sandpaper while her other parts were heating up. When did you know? She waved her hand at him. Shift back. Around 2. He wrapped both arms around Sophia's tiny back and sat up. His muscles clenched and strained with emotion in a beautiful dance. He stood with her still in his arms. Barefoot and dressed only in jeans, he looked like something out of a woman's fantasy. Where are you going? She managed to squeak out when he walked past her. I'm putting her in the bed, he whispered over the child's shoulder. He might be a guardian, but he knew how to handle a lady no matter what her age. She smiled as he gave her his back and walked into the bedroom. She followed behind, watching him gently lay the child down and pull the sheet up to her chin. Sophia mumbled something in her sleep and turned over to the side. He turned and shot her a glare. What? You look like a natural. She grinned. Don't let your womb get all weepy. The kid was scared of the thunder and thought I was her dad. It's not personal. He shifted his weight and stuck in hands in his jeans pockets. I never thought you would be so good with a little girl. Growing up you seemed so distant, so aloof. I didn't have time to be bugged by little kids like you and my sister. He patted toward the kitchen. Want some coffee? Sure. I was just about to make some. She brushed past him, trying to calm her heartbeat. How was it he could still smell so freaking good without even having a shower? Totally wasn't fair. She pulled out the coffee filters from the top cabinet along with the canister of coffee. She busied herself setting up the coffee pot for brewing. She sighed at the pungent scent of the ground beans. She was going to need a lot of caffeine to get through the day. The coffee sputtered and began spilling into the carafe. She pulled out 2 large coffee mugs with big blue flowers and placed them on the counter beside the coffee pot. Reaching in the refrigerator, she tugged out the creamer and set it on the counter. Once the carafe had enough brewed coffee for one, she poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him. No, you take it. He gently shoved it back into her hands. I can wait. Thanks. She frowned. Never in her life had anyone put her first. Certainly no male. But Zane treated her differently, like she was more than a pair of boobs and work boots. Shaking off the silly, nostalgic feeling, she turned her attention back to doctoring her coffee with a liberal amount of creamer. Then she retrieved a canister from the cabinets and cut her eyes at him as she opened the lid. He narrowed his eyes at her as she spooned a heap of dark powder into her coffee. Is that what I think it is? He cocked his head. She could feel the censure pouring off him in waves. She'd taken precautions. 4 years to keep her identity hidden. She just wanted to blend in, be normal. If that meant not shifting, then so be it. The Red Wolves don't have a reputation for being greeted warmly by the rest of the wolves in Arkansas. I really don't blame them. Our kind has been a pain in the ass. I'd rather continue to take precautions to keep from shifting than be placed in a category with them. The less that other wolves know about me, the better. She met his gaze and took a sip. There's no harm in that, is there? She waited a beat to hear a lecture from him about denying what she was, but it never came. His gaze softened as if he understood her reasons. So what's up with the kid? He nodded toward the bedroom as he rested a lean hip against the kitchen counter. She's the daughter of one of my construction workers, Hector. He was in a tight spot last night and needed me to babysit. She shrugged and took a sip of her coffee. The hot liquid slid down her throat with comforting warmth. She could always count on coffee. Anything going on between you two? He scowled and flexed the muscles in his arms. She barked out a laugh. With Hector? He's married with a brood of kids. He had to drop Sophia off because his wife Maria went into labor. Oh. He relaxed back against the counter. The stress lines around his eyes disappeared. Hector's been working with me since I started the business. He's always on time, he's gotten me more workers, and he's loyal. His wife is a doll. She's always inviting me over for dinner and trying to fatten me up. Skylar laughed, thinking back to the last dinner she'd shared with the family. Maria had told Skylar that men liked women with some meat on their bones. Before shoving another piece of blueberry cheesecake at her, the coffee pot had stuttered to a stop. She pulled out the carafe and filled his mug. Creamer or sugar? She glanced up at him. No, just black. Ah, like your heart, she joked. Smartass. He accepted the hot mug and took a sip. Good coffee. Thanks. I like it strong. Like sex. He smirked. Her face heated. Shush. You can't talk about that. Sophia's in the other room. She slugged him in the arm. She's asleep. Besides, I doubt she knows what we are talking about. He chuckled. You never know. The last time she came to the construction site, she picked up a dirty word from one of the workers. Her dad didn't let me forget it either. What did she say? Shit. And she repeated it at preschool. Zane barked out a laugh. Hector blamed me for it when he got the phone call from the school. She didn't even hear it from me. She scowled at his grin. It's not funny. It kind of is. I can't imagine that little bit saying anything so bad. His eyes sparkled as a slow grin teased the corners of his lips. His gaze dipped to her thighs. She'd forgotten about the tight, skimpy shorts she'd slept in last night. So what's your plan for today? She tucked her shirt down, but there was no way it was going to cover her stomach. I need to go get my Harley. His eyes narrowed a little, and he looked away. Where is it? At the Moon Goddess. Do you think it's still there? She knew the shop well. It was off Main Street, and the college crowd liked to frequent the place to get their first tattoo after drinking too much. Even a few of her workers had gotten their arms inked there. She knew there wasn't much parking available, and if he'd left his bike there, there was a strong possibility that it had been towed. It's still there. Matt is the artist for the Guardians. Since I didn't return, he would have moved it to the gated area in the back. So the Guardians get their tats here? I didn't know that. She took another sip and glanced at his back when he turned to refill his mug. The signature black wings and eyes that spanned his back were impressive. The wings were jagged, and there was nothing serene about them as they arced across his back. Then there were the eyes that peered out between the wings as if they were watching her. The tattoo was intimidating. Yep, the same family has done it for generations. He turned around and faced her before taking another sip. Always in Jonesboro? I would think they would have someone in Little Rock do it since it's near the Guardian base. He shook his head. The council and Packmaster wanted it away from the base. Jonesboro is far enough away but close enough to drive to in a few hours. He took another sip. Jonesboro is small enough to seem inconspicuous and large enough that we don't draw too much interest when we ride into town. I'm sure you draw a lot of interest from the college girls in particular. She smirked. She could only imagine how gorgeous he looked riding into town on his Harley Davidson. She'd never seen a guardian who didn't look like a cover model for a magazine. Their sexual appeal alone made them a target for every hot-blooded woman within a 100-mile radius. Her stomach knotted as she thought about how many women he'd already been with, probably thousands. I don't have time to entertain little girls and their fantasies. My job comes first. The little knot in her stomach relaxed. Maybe the number was in the hundreds instead of the thousands. Didn't make her feel much better. She ran her fingers through her hair and set her coffee cup down. She had 1,000 things to do today, from checking on her construction site to seeing how Maria was doing. She didn't need to be thinking about Zane's many conquests as well. I need you to drive me to the moon goddess. His rough voice shook her out of her mental fog. I've got to run by the hospital to check in and see what's going on with the babysitting situation. The grandmother should be getting into town today, so I can drop Sophia off and then take you over to get your bike before going to the construction site. Sounds good. Why don't you go ahead and get in the shower? I'll start breakfast and then maybe little bit will be up by the time you get out. His muscles rippled as he bent to take a skillet out from a cabinet. He moved easily about the kitchen, pulling out eggs and bacon from the fridge and getting plates together. He was clearly comfortable in a kitchen. To her it was an odd sight. What? He frowned when he caught her looking at him. I just didn't expect you to know how to cook. I know growing up your family had a maid. The Steele family's housekeeper made no bones about how she felt about Skylar. She'd made it clear to the Steeles that Skylar was beneath them, and that Katie shouldn't be playing with her. You mean Hildy? He snorted. She cleaned, but she never once set foot in the kitchen. My mom didn't like anyone in her kitchen. It was her domain. He smiled with genuine affection. I didn't know that. I thought your mom was always too busy with running charities and looking after you guys. I just assumed she didn't have time to cook. My mom made time for the things that mattered. She always told me that family came first before anything else. He cracked the egg against the corner of the counter and spilled the yellow, oozy contents into the small bowl he'd retrieved from the cabinet. He cracked several more before dipping a fork into the mixture and whisking until the eggs were beaten and frothy. Skylar nodded. Your mom was a very smart woman. Her first memory of being shown kindness was from Victoria Steele. She didn't think she would ever forget the woman. Yes, she is. He cut his eyes at her. She asked Katie about you throughout the years. She wanted to know how you were doing. Really? A twinge of guilt assaulted her gut. She should have kept in touch with his mom. At least she could have sent a letter or taken the time to make a phone call. But she hadn't been sure how it would be received, and she hadn't wanted to bother the woman. Yes, she always knew you were going to be successful in whatever you put your mind to. He grinned. And now look at you. You have your own construction company. That's something to be proud of. Thank you. She meant it. Felt good to hear him say that. I've thought about her too. About your whole family, she admitted. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. Really? Did you think about me? He took a step closer and brushed a stray hair out of her eyes. Her breath hitched in the back of her throat as her heart thudded so loudly. She was sure he could hear every beat. His spicy male scent washed over her, beckoning her to lean closer. She didn't fight it. It was like being drawn to the sun, knowing it was going to burn once you touched it but being unable to help yourself. Maybe, she whispered. Maybe? That doesn't sound very convincing. He stepped closer and lifted a strand of her hair, teasing it between two fingers. Of course I thought about you. You were part of my life when I was little. A slow, wicked smile touched the corners of his lips and spread across his mouth. Her stomach heated as her gaze focused on those lips and the pleasure he could give. What about after you grew up? You're not a little girl anymore, Skylar. Did you think about me then? She met his heated gaze and grabbed the hand that kept teasing that strand beside her cheek. Yeah, I did. I thought about you a lot, Zane, she admitted. His groan was dark and guttural, and it made her want to rip off his jeans with her teeth and take him in her mouth. I would be lying if I said I didn't. Did you think about me? She braced herself for the truth. I wondered what happened to the little girl I once knew. I asked Katie about you, but as you know, she's always very vague when it comes to giving answers. His pupils dilated as he looked slowly down her body. But you can. Bet your ass if I had known you'd turned into such a beauty, I would have moved heaven and earth to track you down. She could smell his arousal and felt her own lust dampen her panties. A surge of disappointment zipped through her when she remembered he couldn't smell her. If he could, would he still want her? Or was he just attracted to the visual? He clamped a large hand around her waist and tugged her close. Her breasts pushed against his chest, and the heat from his body made her sink farther into his massive chest. The prickly hairs poked through her thin shirt and teased her nipples with each heavy breath. His hand trailed up her back and cupped the base of her neck. Leaned down, angling his head for a kiss. Skylar. The tiny voice was like cold water being dumped on her oversexed body. She cleared her throat and stepped away from Zane as Sophia walked into the kitchen and rubbed her eyes. Hey sweetie, how do you sleep? She knelt down in front of the child and brushed her tangled hair away from her forehead. With dark hair that matched her eyes, she looked like a doll. Her cautious eyes went from Skylar to Zane before landing on her again. This is my friend Zane. She looked up at Zane, hoping he wouldn't intimidate the girl with his size. In the dark he was big, but in the bright light of day he was a giant to a little girl. Hi. He squatted in front of the little girl and rested his elbows on his knees. I think you might have mistaken me for a giant stuffed animal last night. Skylar scowled and slugged him playfully in the arm. He laughed and held out his hand to Sophia. The little one looked at his large hand and looked back at Skylar. It's okay. He's my friend. He may be big, but he's really nice. She carefully placed her hand in the middle of Zane's larger one. An image of him cradling a baby to his chest flashed through Skylar's mind. Did he want kids? Had he ever thought about settling down and mating? Was that something he wanted? Or was his job his priority and the only thing he wanted out of life? What's wrong? Zane's voice shook her out of her daydreams. You look like you just saw one of those sappy beer commercials with the horse and dog. He scowled at her. Nothing's wrong. She steeled her expression and smiled at the little girl. Are you hungry, Sophia? Where's the doggy? The doggy left this morning, Skylar answered quickly. She decided that distraction was the best course of action. Are you hungry? I want pancakes. I don't have pancakes, but I do have eggs and bacon. How does that sound? Skylar smiled. I want pancakes. Her bottom lip quivered. Skylar held her breath. Maybe we could go out and get some. How about you help me make breakfast while Skylar gets a shower? Zane cocked his head at the little girl. Zane, I don't know. Sophia didn't normally do well around strangers. She was such a shy and introverted child who loved playing with her invisible playmates. Skylar had worried for the little girl ever since her mom had gotten pregnant with this last baby. What if she didn't feel special anymore? You know that princesses eat eggs and bacon for breakfast every day, right? Zane gave his full attention to the little girl. The little girl's eyes widened for a second, and just like that, her bottom lip stopped quivering. Instead of a frown, there was now a smile on her little bow-shaped mouth. Princesses know that eating eggs and bacon for breakfast helps the farmers make money. Every time you eat one of the things they raise or grow, it puts money in their pockets. Now if you had pancakes, well, that doesn't necessarily help anyone but the company that sells the pancake mix. So, basically you're doing your job as a good princess to help others. Zane stood to his full height. I want eggs and bacon. A bright smile filled her face. Skylar's mouth dropped open. Zane's hand was at her back, guiding her into the bathroom. Now go get cleaned up and we should have breakfast on the table for you when you get out. He closed the door. She blinked at the closed door for a few seconds before shaking her head. For someone so distant and in control, Zane was unbelievably tender with Sophia. She thought she had him figured out, but now she wasn't so sure. She just have to wait and see. Chapter 44. Zane kept his eyes on the child as she leaned closer to him from her perch on the stool. He'd pulled up the tall kitchen stool near the stove so she could help lay the bacon strips in the frying pan. Once the grease started sputtering, he'd covered the pan and pulled her stool to a safe distance so she wouldn't get a grease burn. Easy. Not too close. Remember what I said about the cooking bacon? He kept his voice soft so as not to frighten the child. He remembered the frightened little girl climbing on top of his chest last night as the thunder boomed across the sky. He tried to explain that she needed to go back to bed with Skylar, but she was too sleepy and had conked out once her head hit his chest. With no other option, he'd resigned himself to being a human sleeping bag. It reminded him of the times Katie had come into his room when they were kids. She'd been frightened by a storm and had sought him out for protection. Growing up as the child of Jonathan Steele, both Zane and Katie knew that once the lights were out in their parents' room, they better not disturb them. So, whenever Katie got scared, she sought out her big brother instead. He would always pretend that she was bothering him, but in reality he was grateful for the time spent together. Is it ready yet? Sophia looked up at him with brown eyes as big as saucers. Chapter 45. Not yet. We need to wait until it gets crispy on both sides. He lifted the cover and turned the strips over with a fork. The meat sizzled in the pan and the aroma made his stomach growl. Your tummy sounds like a dragon. She patted her small hand on his stomach. He barked out a laugh. I've been called a lot of things, but a dragon is not one of them. He pulled out a white plate from the cabinet and sat it on the corner in front of her. He pulled some sheets of paper towels off the roll and handed them to her. I need you to put these on the plate for the bacon. She took them out of his hand and gave the plate a thoughtful look. Why? So the grease can drain off the bacon and soak into the paper towels. He glanced at the bacon one more time. The bacon needs a diaper? She looked up at him with a slight frown. He didn't fight the grin. I've never heard it compared to that, but yes, like a diaper. Sophia wasted no time and lined up several pieces of paper on the plate. Perfect. Just in time, kid. He lifted the lid off the skillet and picked up the bacon with his fork. He lined the bacon strips side by side and then turned his attention back to the empty skillet. Using his fork, he whipped the eggs one last time before pouring the liquid into the hot skillet. The eggs bubbled and popped in the hot grease as they cooked. I hope you like scrambled. She nodded and bent over the plate of bacon. How's it going? Need a hand? Skylar came out of the bedroom in jeans, white t-shirt and wet hair. His chest ached with want. She was fucking gorgeous. We've got it. He cleared his throat. Grabbing a spatula, he cut the eggs into pieces and turned them over to finish cooking. After a few seconds, he reached for a bowl and dumped the scrambled eggs inside. Sophia, what are you doing? Skylar came up behind the girl and gave her a hug. Helping. It's what princesses do. What's going on with the bacon? Skylar asked. You don't like crispy bacon? Zane scowled. He couldn't remember how Skylar had liked her bacon when she was little. That's not what I meant. I meant, why does the bacon look all bundled up like a baby? She looked up and met his gaze. A confused smile lingered on her face. What? He looked over Sophia's shoulder at the plate of bacon. He chuckled. Each piece of bacon was wrapped in its own paper towel. Well, I did tell her the bacon needed a diaper. He shook his head. I didn't think she was so literal. She's 4. To her, everything is literal. Skylar grinned as she planted a kiss on the crown of the little girl's head. Diaper or no, let's eat. I'm starving. He lifted Sophia off the stool. How about you, princess? Are you hungry? She nodded and ran over to the kitchen island and crawled up on the stool. Chapter 46. Skylar couldn't stop looking at Zane throughout breakfast. He'd been so gentle and sweet to Sophia. She didn't remember him being so thoughtful when they were kids. But then again, he'd probably thought of her as his sister's annoying friend. As soon as they had finished their meal, she left Sophia at the island while she walked over to the stove. She set up a coloring book and crayons for Sophia to color while she cleaned up the kitchen and Zane took a shower. She was glad she'd remembered to get several changes of clothes for him. The way he kept shifting was going to have her at the store every day buying him more clothes. She froze with her hands in the dishwater and glanced down at Sophia. What if he shifted in front of Sophia? Or worse, what if he tried to harm her? Sophia stopped coloring and looked up at Skylar. Skylar forced a smile and kept washing the plate. Did you get enough to eat? Sophia nodded and continued coloring the chicken a shade of blue. I guess you're excited about seeing your grandmother today? She nodded but focused her attention on staying in the lines. Skylar would never know what having a grandmother was like. Her father had never mentioned any living grandparents. The few times she'd asked if she had a grandmother, her abusive father had flown into a rage and whipped her with a belt. She'd been no bigger than Sophia at the time. That was her first lesson in what her childhood was going to look like. She patted her hands on the dish towel and took the little girl by the hand. Let's get you changed out of your pajamas and ready to see your grandma. Chapter 47. What's up, assholes? Damon strode into the diner and nodded at Jackson and Lucien before easing his big frame into the booth. Lucien's stomach clenched as his fellow guardian sat down across from him. He'd figured Barrett was going to send someone to check up on them. He just didn't figure it would be Damon. The brother didn't like to stay away from his mate Ava. Lucien couldn't blame him. Ava Trahan was gorgeous. Damon, what are you doing here? Lucien frowned and pushed his coffee cup away. Just seeing what's going on in this neck of the woods. Damon flagged down a passing waitress and ordered a coffee. Lucien could feel Jackson's eyes on him, but he didn't dare look at him. He knew Damon was here to find Zane. Where's Zane? Damon crossed his arms over his chest and glared. And don't fucking say you don't know. Shit. Jackson breathed out a heavy sigh. Damon leaned forward and narrowed his gaze on both of them. Do you two understand what the penalty is for keeping information from your packmaster? I'm guessing it's not good. Lucien shook his head and locked eyes with his fellow guardian. Look, man, you're asking us to rat out our brother who we've pledged to be loyal to. I'm asking you to be loyal to your pack. Damon growled low and deep. The patrons sitting behind them quickly got up from their booth and headed for the door. Lucien's heart dropped to his stomach. He was in a no-win situation. He was either going to keep Zane's situation to himself and be disloyal to his pack, or he was going to rat out his brother. What if it were Jaden? What would you do? Jackson ran his hand through his hair. I would do the right thing. That's what I'd fucking do, Damon countered. But what if both things are the right thing to do? Lucien insisted. What if, no matter what we do, someone is going to get hurt? Damon settled back into the booth and looked between them with an assessing gaze. The scar on his cheek seemed to twitch under the cafe lighting. I'm not alone. Damon cocked his head. Fuck. Lucien held his breath. So Barrett is with you. Perfect. Fucking perfect. There was no way out of this shitstorm now. Zane was lost and now both he and Jackson faced losing their jobs as guardians because they'd been looking out for their brother. Not Barrett. Damon, there you are. Ava made her way over to their booth. I thought you said we were eating next door at that restaurant. She frowned and glanced over at his companions. Jackson, Lucien. I didn't know you guys were in Jonesboro. She smiled. Hey Ava, they answered in unison. They had to bring some guardians over here to get their tats. Damon kept his glare on them. They decided to stay a little while longer. Oh yeah. She let Damon pull her down to his knee to sit. Is there anything fun to do here? I heard there's a club over on the other side of town. I wouldn't recommend it. Lucien sniffed his leather jacket and winced. It's mainly college chicks who don't take no for an answer. Plus it's smoky. I'll have to remember that. She gave Damon a warning glare. Damon chuckled and wrapped a hand around her waist. You don't have to worry about me. I wasn't. I was worried about some random bitch putting her hands on you and then me having to put my hands on her. Preferably around her neck. Ava gave him a pretty smile. So what are you doing here, Ava? Lucien asked. I'm here to check on the renovation of my home. That's right. I forgot you had a house here. He remembered when her home had been bombed after she'd been kidnapped by red wolves. I didn't know there was anything left. It was bombed pretty badly, but a good portion of the house was still standing. She shrugged. After doing some research, I found out that it would be a good investment to have it reconstructed and put it on the market. Not like I have any plans to move back here, not now. She glanced at Damon and grinned. That's smart. I hope you found a good contractor. You know they are notorious for sticking it to you. Lucien took a sip of his coffee and relaxed a little. This was good. If Ava was in the dark about why Damon was really here, then maybe they still had time to find and help Zane before Barrett found out. He just needed a little more time. And a whole lot of love. Chapter 48. What do you mean you can't take her? You know I have to be on the construction site today. especially since you're not going to be there and I missed yesterday. Skylar had too many distractions going, and she couldn't keep putting off her responsibilities. She needed to finish the house, get paid, and buy the apartment building before it got sold out from under her. That had been the plan all along, and she wasn't about to change it for anything or anybody. I can't, Skylar. I can't leave Maria yet. The delivery was complicated and the doctor said I needed to be around. His eyes grew wide with concern and the bags under them suggested he had not slept all night. Complicated? What do you mean? Her stomach dropped. Hector cradled his daughter to his chest and rubbed tiny circles on her back. She'd been happy to see her daddy when they'd arrived at the hospital and had run to him in the hallway. There was a lot of bleeding with the delivery. The bleeding has stopped for now, but they are keeping an eye on it. They ended up giving her a blood transfusion. Oh, Hector. I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me? She was a horrible person. She was worried about a job while he was worried about his wife's life. You've done so much for me already. I really hate to bother you, Skylar. We're friends. You can ask me for anything. You know that, right? He'd stuck with her through thick and thin, sometimes even turning down another job that paid more so he could work with her. She'd never forget that. Then I need to ask you to watch Sophia another day. He cringed as he said the words. Where's Grandma? Grandma had some car trouble. She's getting it fixed today and hopefully will be here by tonight or tomorrow at the latest. He shook his head. She held out her hands. Sophia went willingly into her arms and stuck her finger in her mouth. We'll be okay, won't we, Sophia? The little girl nodded. Skylar, are you sure? I mean, I can get the neighbor to give her some Benadryl and watch her. Are you crazy? You know she'll get hives, maybe even a stronger allergic reaction if she goes over there. I can take her. She met Sophia's big brown eyes. You don't mind spending another night with me, do you? I like it at your house. You have a doggy. Hector barked out a laugh. A doggy? I had no idea you had a dog. Not all the time. He just comes around when he's hungry. She smiled at her. Inside joke. Thanks, Skylar. I really appreciate it. He frowned. What are you going to do about work today? Don't worry about it. Just stay here and concentrate on getting your wife better. She smiled. How's the baby? A grin crossed his face. She's beautiful. Just like her mother. Ah, another girl. I hope she gives you a hard time. She laughed. I'm sure she will. We named her Sky. Chapter 49. Skylar held Sophia's hand as they walked out of the hospital. She was immediately greeted with a hot blast of stifling heat the second she stepped outside. She squinted against the bright sun as she headed toward the truck. She was still in shock that they thought enough of her to name the baby Sky. They were not related by blood, but they'd forged a friendship through the trials of life, and sometimes those bonds were just as strong. She brushed a tear away from her cheek as she opened the door to her truck. What's wrong? Zane frowned. Nothing. It's not nothing. You're crying. What's wrong? They named the baby Sky after you. She must be beautiful. His eyes softened. She froze, mesmerized by the sincerity in his face. Shifting her weight, she looked away. Why do you do that? Do what? She asked as she gathered the child into her truck and buckled her in the car seat. She'd bought the seat at a garage sale and kept it on hand in case she needed it for Hector's kids. Why do you look so uncomfortable when I give you a compliment? You must know how beautiful you are. He reached for her hand. His fingertips grazed the back of her arm and sent shivers up and down her spine. Lying had never really been Skylar's forte. It was what had gotten her in trouble as a little girl, and she didn't see any reason to start lying now that she was a woman. I have red hair. I'm not a blonde or a brunette. I have qualities that men don't consider beautiful. So when you say those things, it makes me uncomfortable because I know they're not true. His gaze narrowed, and the air between them thickened until it was hard to draw an easy breath. Wordlessly, he stalked around the truck, moving with slow deliberation until he stood inches from her. Hear me when I say this. I don't lie. I never have. His ice blue eyes flashed with anger, and his chest heaved with each carefully chosen word. Whoever fed you the bullshit that you are not beautiful is and will always be a liar. Jealousy often makes people say untrue things. Your qualities that you so eloquently speak of are unique. Hair as fiery as the sun itself and eyes the color of rare gems are qualities that not every woman possesses, but they are qualities that every woman desires. And you are every man's fantasy. When I look at you, you make me lose any control that I ever thought I had. Here, standing next to you, it's all I can do not to pull your jeans down and take you up against the truck. Her mouth dropped open. Her body tingled in all the right places. She leaned into Chapter 50. Don't start something you cannot finish, Zane. She wanted to tease him to the point of no return. She wanted him wild and out of control. Skylar, he growled, yet he didn't move away. He held his ground as his gaze dipped to her parted mouth. Skylar, I'm thirsty, Sophia called out from inside the truck. She resisted a groan and stepped back. Okay, sweetie, we'll stop and get you a drink. What's up with little bit? I thought you were dropping her off with her father. Change of plans. It seems Grandma isn't here yet, so I'm letting her stay a little while longer. She slid into the truck and gave the little girl a smile, before glancing back at Zane. So after we stop at the gas station and grab something to drink, I'll drive you over to get your bike and then I'll head out to the work site. She had a 4-year-old in tow, a werewolf who couldn't control his shift, staying at her apartment, and she was behind schedule with work on her house. She sighed and threw the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot. So much for things going according to plan. Chapter 51. Zane watched as Skylar drove away from the tattoo shop. He didn't let his eyes leave her until she was out of sight. Then he turned his attention to his bike. Matt was a man of his word. He'd kept Zane's Harley locked up in the parking area behind the Moon Goddess tattoo shop. After finding out from Matt that both Lucien and Jackson were still in town looking for him, he knew he didn't have time to waste. Now that he had his bike, he needed to get a solid lead on whoever was dealing meth in Jonesboro. He had a hunch that would lead him to the werewolf who'd escaped the drug bust that night. He grabbed the tarp draped over his bike and snatched it off. A smile stretched across his face as he caressed his bike with his gaze. Hey baby, I missed you. He ran his hand gently down the blood-red Harley Davidson breakout. Bright red and chrome, she was dressed out like one badass bitch. Some of the other guardians like Damon and Jaden had chosen colors like black and gray for their breakouts, but not him. He'd always been partial to red. He associated the color with courage and fearlessness. He grinned as Skylar's face popped into his mind. Apparently he liked his women like he liked his Harleys. Hot, red and full of fire. He straddled his bike and started the engine. The motor rumbled to life, growling between his legs. His blood heated as he revved the engine. He loved this. The sound of his screaming eagle pipes, the smell of leather and metal, and the feeling of freedom and power. This was his office astride a Harley. He gunned the engine and pulled out onto the street. He didn't miss the stairs. The women on the sidewalk were shooting at him as he cruised down the street. Humans always wanted a biker. What they didn't know was that with him they were getting a werewolf biker. He made a right at the corner and kept his speed under the limit until the streets became a highway. He pointed his bike in the direction of Skylar's construction project and sped down the highway, letting the wind and the sun seep into his soul. I'm hungry. Sophia looked up at Skylar from under the hard hat she'd made the little girl wear. A bead of sweat trickled from her temple down her plump cheek. She swiped the back of her dirty hands across her face, leaving behind a smudge of brown. The little girl had played happily under the tree in the backyard, pushing discarded pieces of wood blocks around in the dirt like cars while Skylar oversaw the continued work on the kitchen. I'll grab our lunch out of the truck and we'll eat. Okay? She jogged over to her truck and opened the door. Thank goodness she'd stopped at the store for some sandwich fixings, snacks, drinks, and a cooler before heading back to the construction site. So far, she'd given Sophia 2 snacks of animal crackers. And it wasn't even noon yet. Tugging the cooler and the bag out of the truck, she headed back toward the tree. She found a grassy spot and sat down before pulling out the antibacterial gel. Bathing her hands, she held out the bottle to Sophia, who held out her palms. She squirted a generous amount into her hands and instructed her to rub them together. She pulled out some paper towels and wiped the excess off the little girl's hands. After making the first ham and cheese sandwich, she handed it to Sophia. Opening a bag of chips, she placed it between them and then snagged 2 ice cold waters out of the cooler. She quickly made herself a sandwich as she watched Sophia eat in silence. The little girl pulled off the brown edges of the bread before taking her first. Skylar smiled. She knew better than to give a 4-year-old a sandwich with crust. She'd seen too many families out at the park having a picnic, and not once did the children have a sandwich with crust on it. She took a bite of her sandwich and wondered if maybe she should take Sophia to the park once she finished the project. It was hard to know how to treat a child well when she'd never been shown an ounce of kindness by her own father when she was growing up. Her mind drifted back to Zane. His family had been the only ones to ever treat her like she was worth something. If it hadn't been for them, who knew what would have happened to her? She might have ended up on drugs or homeless or even dead. Girls like her needed a safe place where they could escape from abusive families the system couldn't keep track of. She was bound and determined to make her life count for something. That was her mission, to build a safe haven. Sophia picked up a chip and nibbled on it like a little bunny. Hey Skylar, you need to come look at this. Sanchez, one of her construction workers, called out from the kitchen door. Be right there. She brushed the hair out of Sophia's face and then hopped to her feet. She jogged over to the back of the house where Sanchez was waiting for her. The young man was only a few years older than her but was married with 2 kids. He was a WER and had made it his high school sweetheart right out of school and had never gone to college. He said he never was one for studying, so he went into construction work. He was a hard worker and smart too. She had told him he would be running his own construction company in a few years. What's up? She walked into the kitchen and looked at Sanchez. The cabinets are the wrong color. He waved his hand at the kitchen counters, sitting on the middle of the floor. What? That's impossible. Her heart dropped. We ordered maple cabinets, but these are cream-colored with a glaze. This can't be. Her chest tightened as she stared at the cabinets. Even if we got the correct cabinets by the end of the week, we still won't make our deadline. What do you want to do? Sanchez rested his hands on his hips, awaiting her next order. That's how Sanchez always was, so damn even-keeled. Sucking in a deep breath, she bent down to pull the protective covering away from the cabinet. The cabinets were glazed in an off-white cream. They were completely different look from the style the owner had picked out. She cocked her head. She liked them even better than the ones that the owner had picked out. Does the supplier know they sent the wrong cabinets? Not yet. Sanchez arched his eyebrow. They will. She stood up and glanced over at the sample of the granite countertop sitting atop the work table. She picked up the sample and held up next to the cabinet. The cabinets brought out the cream and gray colors of the granite and made it pop. She reached in her jeans pocket, pulled out her phone and snapped a few photos. To be honest, I think they look better with this countertop. She scrolled through her contacts. So what do you want us to do? Sanchez asked. By this time the rest of the workers had filtered into the kitchen. They stood there casting worried glances at each other. I want everyone to grab a quick lunch and then I want you to put these cabinets in. But they're not the ones the owner wanted, Sanchez said. I'm about to change the owner's mind. Skylar pulled up the number for the distributor. But first, I'm calling the distributor to let him know he's giving me these cabinets for the same amount as the first cabinets. It was his mistake. Chapter 52. What's wrong? Damon could see the distress on Ava's face as soon as she got off the phone. The cabinets came in, but they are the wrong ones. Her phone dinged and she glanced down at it. Then the contractor needs to fix the mistake. He shook his head. I knew this was a bad idea, hiring someone without meeting them in person. You can't do a remodel without being there for all the damn details. She sent me a picture. Ava nibbled on her bottom lip. She says the new cabinets are more expensive. I'm not paying 1 more cent. He crossed his arms. Well, she said that since it was a mistake, they would let us have them for the same cost as the original cabinets. She held up the phone. Look at the picture. I think these cabinets actually look a lot better. What do you think? He took the phone and studied the picture. Still, they made a mistake. I don't want someone you are doing business with taking advantage of you. He handed her the phone back. She grinned. So you like them? I knew it. When are we driving out there? He needed to lay eyes on this contractor. Now, if you're free from whatever top secret business Barrett has you on. She gave him a saccharine smile. Smartass. You like my smartass, she quipped. You're right. I do love your ass. He reached out and clamped 2 hands on her butt and pulled her into his arms. She giggled as she snuggled into his chest. So let's go right now. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him down for a kiss. He covered her mouth with his, taking his time to savor her sweet taste. He loved her with an intensity that frightened him at times. Fine. Let's go. He gave her ass a squeeze. His phone buzzed in his jeans pocket. Ugh. Ignore it. She narrowed her eyes. Can't, babe. Might be work. Reluctantly, he pulled away from her and reached in his back pocket for his phone. He sighed as soon as he saw it was Barrett calling. Ignore it. She tried rubbing her boobs against his chest in an attempt to distract him. It's Barrett. I have to answer it. She frowned as he hit the green button. Hey. What the fuck took you so long? I was beginning to think you'd run off with those other 3 assholes who can't manage to answer their fucking cell phones, Barrett rumbled. Damon fought a smile. His packmaster was known for keeping his cool, but these last few days had certainly pissed off Barrett to put him on edge like this. I've got Ava here distracting me. Not planning on running off with anyone else. He winked. No visuals. Please. Damon laughed. What have you found out? Where are my guardians? Damon took a deep breath. I tracked Lucien and Jackson to a cafe this morning, where they looked like they were either hungover or their dog died. That dog better not be Zane, Barrett growled. Damon shook his head. Look, boss, I'm not sure what's going on with those 2, but I do know they are hiding something. Has Zane gone rogue? Barrett's voice was eerily calm. Damon knew his pack master held Zane in the highest regard. He was his second in command. I'm not sure, Damon answered as honestly as he could. But that's what I'm here to fucking find out.